You're listening to What Happened to Nelson Mandela's South Africa, a special series running through the Conversation Weekly, marking 30 years of post-apartheid South Africa. It's 1999, and Nelson Mandela's presidency of South Africa is coming to an end. During his tenure, Mandela had brought South Africans together, dismantling racist policies after nearly 5 decades of apartheid and setting the country on a new democratic path.
And that the consequences of apartheid still permeate our society and define the lives of millions of South Africans as lives of deprivation. Those challenges are unchanged.
When Mandela stood down after one term in office, Thabo Mbeki, his deputy, was his obvious successor, and in June 1999, Mbeki was elected president.
I solemnly and sincerely promise that we'll always promote all that will advance the Republic and oppose all that may harm it.
In this series, we're exploring what has happened to Nelson Mandela's South Africa as the country marks 3 decades of post-apartheid democracy. I'm Gemma Ware, host of the Conversation Weekly, and with me for this series is my colleague Thabo Mbeki, politics and society editor at The Conversation in Johannesburg. Hi, Thabo.
Hi, Gemma.
So, Thabo, in our first episode, we heard about the initial transition away from apartheid rule and about Mandela's first few years as president. But we're in 1999, and by this point, Mandela was 80 years old, and he decided not to run for another second term in office. So, tell us about the man who succeeded him, Thabo Mbeki.
I'll describe him as a philosopher and a man who's really passionate about Africa taking its place, its rightful place in the world, what he called Africa's Renaissance. Thabo Mbeki's journey with the ANC, which was then a liberation movement, dates back to the 1950s when he became actively involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. In the 1960s, after the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress were banned, he went into exile and he received a master's in economics in the UK. He also underwent military training in the Soviet Union while in exile. By the 1970s, he had earned considerable respect within the ranks of the African National Congress.
And he'd been deputy president to Mandela, so really high up in the echelons of power. But then he took over in 1999, big moment. What was that like for him, and what hopes were pinned on him?
Well, Mbeki's presidency was met with a mix of anticipation and expectation. Many hoped he would continue Mandela's legacy of reconciliation and progress, while also steering the country towards economic prosperity. But Mbeki was his own man.
And what actually characterized his presidency?
Well, he served 2 terms until 2008, and during his tenure, the economy had grown significantly. By February 2005, economic growth was higher than it had been in 20 years, including before South Africa became a democracy in 1994. However, his policies faced criticism from the left within the ANC alliance. He was accused of driving a neoliberal agenda that was anti-labor and anti-poor.
So, Thabo, I know you've been speaking to somebody who was right there in the thick of things in the Thabo Mbeki presidency. Tell us about him.
I spoke to Michael Sachs, who is an economics professor at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And he's also former head of the budget office in South Africa's National Treasury.
I learned economics when I went to the budget office. I had studied economics before, but I think I really learned economics there, at least the economics of fiscal policy. And it probably changed my views about what was possible.
Let me take you back a little and just to set the scene. Nelson Mandela was elected president, the ANC is in power. And how would you describe the economic hopes and aspirations of the country?
I think there was an optimism in a sense. It seemed as though the country had these very deep problems, but also had the resources to solve them and had the institutions that would also ensure that the country was focused on the right problems. And that it would be a democratic process. Essentially, at that time then, in the liberation movement, there was a belief that there would be 2 stages of the revolution. The first stage would be democratic, and the second stage would be more socialist-oriented. So there was a belief also that the ANC was popular. You know, Mandela was president, right? So it was almost like we are governed by angels. And many of them were angels. And of course, in the real world, there are no angels, and every angel is also a devil. But it's hard to not get carried away with the optimism that we had the resources, we had the institutions, and we had the leadership. And not the leadership of one man, but a collective leadership that appeared strong enough to carry out some real fundamental transformation. So that's, I think, how people felt in those early years of the 1990s.
The General Household Survey released by Stats SA revealing that the number of households now relying on social grants in South Africa has risen to 30%.
We have the most expansive social grant system on the continent. The intention here is to cushion people against poverty. Maybe you'd like to talk about the motivation behind that.
The immediate period after the democratic transition in 1994, the ANC ran a program of austerity. Essentially, that's what it was, that aimed to reduce spending and at the same time reorganize the state. And those were very difficult times. But from about 2002, fiscal policy became expansionary. And one element of that was a very large expansion of two grants in particular. One is the old age grant. If you're not affluent, you have access to this grant. And the value of that grant was increased and the eligibility was extended to younger people. And the second was the child support grant, which was rolled out and extended to all children. The child support grant for each child is still well below the food poverty line. So it's insufficient, but it still makes a substantial difference.
Let's talk a bit about Black economic empowerment. I mean, the rationale for it. What informed Black economic empowerment as a policy?
Well, it's very simple. All of the property in the country, and particularly productive property, is owned by a single ethnic group, which is white people. And that's essentially the situation we were in 1994. And so you had a government now that was accountable to a majority that was poor and Black. It's kind of a no-brainer that you're going to have to find ways of transferring ownership of that capital. Capital had been bottled up in South Africa until the democratic transition. It was unable to leave the country. And in a sense, that's why the transition happened. That's why capital supported the democratic transition, because the quid pro quo from the beginning was going to be some exit from the stagnation and quagmire of apartheid society. So there was also a sense that a Black capitalist would be more patriotic. There was also a strong element of skills development, huge. Supplier development, preferential procurement for Black people and small companies. So there's a broad range of measures that have in common an objective of redressing the historic injustice of apartheid, which was cast in a racial mold. Into the first decade of the 21st century, there was a commodity boom. And so when there's a commodity boom, stocks rise, and stocks were rising year after year. But also the commodity boom in particular made South Africa a very profitable place to be, to own stock. And so in a sense, it was very easy to finance this Black economic empowerment because you just gave Black people a share of 100 Rand. And before you know it, it would be 1,000 Rand. And so there was even optimism that this would be a success as well, and that we would create a Black patriotic business class. And others even spoke about a patriotic bourgeoisie. But also there was growing consciousness, and in particular there was a kind of a bellwether speech by Thabo Mbeki that spoke of the crass emerging capitalist consumerism amongst Black people essentially. And during this buoyant period, there was also a very large expansion of government. It was very deliberate expansion of employment of nurses and doctors and police officers and teachers that took place in that period, financed by that economic boom. A very large extension of social grants, which had a very material impact on poverty. Government was, rolling out historically unprecedented numbers of housing units and giving them away for free to the poor population. There was a sense of progress and that the social responsibility of the state was expanding And there was a kind of virtuous process of growth and social development that you could point to that, again, would not solve the problems overnight, but at least you could see some material progress.
Colonialism and apartheid were essentially economic, and then the policies that fell under the umbrella of Black economic empowerment were intended to address that. Are there any examples of successful initiatives under the rubric of Black empowerment?
Look, there are many that would argue that Black economic empowerment has been a success, not in terms of transforming the economy, but the leadership of many of the large banks are predominantly Black, particularly at the most senior levels. The leadership of boards of mining houses and listed institutions is predominantly Black. Other people would argue that doesn't matter because ownership is not Black, which is very true. But in terms of its intent, which was to create a kind of Black business class, one could say that does exist. We do have many in management and in wealth, a class of Black people that are in leadership positions in the private sector. And in many ways, it hasn't gone far enough, definitely. I'm not saying that the problem is solved. The private sector and management in the private sector, let me just say, is still overwhelmingly dominated by white people.
Thabo, the analysis we've heard here from Michael, it paints a picture of the Mbeki years as a kind of mixed bag in some ways, that they did bring significant changes, but maybe not in all aspects of society.
Yes, it's given some positive results. Mbeki's presidency led to economic growth and stability in South Africa. Domestic economic development went up, but as Michael suggested, it wasn't enough to address the deep-rooted injustices and inequalities of the past.
Okay, so in 2008, Mbeki's presidency came to an end with his recall by the African National Congress, which essentially meant that he was ousted from power. What were the circumstances surrounding that?
Well, he was criticized for his leadership. A major criticism nationally at the time was his attitude towards AIDS. Basically, which was AIDS denialism. But the main reason Mbeki was ousted was that he had lost the presidency of the ruling ANC. And then he lost it in December 2007 when the Congress elected Jacob Zuma to be the president of the party.
So he was ousted and Jacob Zuma takes over leadership of the ANC. What kind of a figure was Zuma at this point in the ANC?
Like Mandela, Zuma had been incarcerated on Robben Island, for many years, and also went into exile and became a leader within the ANC in exile. But Zuma's years in office unleashed what many see as a significant turning point in South Africa's democratic history. To shed light on the next chapter in South Africa's politics, I reached out to Mashupye Maserumule, Professor of Public Affairs at the Tshwane University of Technology in Pretoria, South Africa. He's an expert in public administration and politics and is writing a new book delving into South Africa's political landscape during Zuma's presidency.
I am part of the generation that perhaps fully experience the perniciousness of the apartheid system. I grew up in a rural area in the Limpopo province, one of the self-governing territory, and I experienced the hardship of apartheid. I was part of the youth of that time who took it upon themselves to say that we are going to challenge the system. And we're very happy that ultimately the system could actually be challenged, that subsequently we could actually see the changes that subsequently came from all those efforts.
Jacob Zuma, sworn in as South Africa's fourth democratically elected president.
I commit myself to the service of our nation with dedication.
In 2009, in May, Zuma was elected the president of South Africa. This is described as a turning point for the ANC and for the country. Can you explain that?
Yeah. In 2005, Zuma was implicated in the judgment that involved his financial advisor. And following that judgment, which clearly said that there was a corrupt relationship between him and his financial advisor, the president of that time, President Mbeki, dismissed Zuma. And he used that moment to try and project himself as a victim. He used some of those people who thought that Mbeki was against them. So they formed some kind of the congregation of the wounded. And unfortunately also, they managed to bring behind them your South African Communist Party. For some strange reason, they look at Zuma as a potential alternative to Thabo Mbeki's neoliberal policy style. It was very interesting because before Zuma was actually dismissed, he was part of the ANC leadership that accepted the very same policy that South African Communist Party were complaining about. They pushed Zuma as their own candidate, as an alternative to Thabo Mbeki, and they went all out to make sure that they marshal as much support as possible behind him. And the narrative at that time was that Thabo Mbeki is actually using public resources to settle political scores, but at the same time also there were ideological contestation, and they used that as well to campaign against Mbeki and put Zuma's name forward. And Zuma also played the ball. He is good in terms of selling rhetoric. He is good in terms of playing into the emotions, particularly of those who are in the margin of society. And that is why it was not surprising that he could actually become the president of the ANC, and he beat Thabo Mbeki with the support of his party and with the support of the tripartite alliance.
The tripartite alliance refers to what we said COSATU, which is the Congress of South African Trade Unions. It's a labor federation, and the South African Communist Party. These two are in a governing a tripartite alliance with the African National Congress. But how then would you characterize Jacob Zuma's presidency? I mean, what were the key policy initiatives made during his tenure as president?
What was surprising was that Zuma, when he became a president, he did not really have a clear idea that he represented. He was just essentially complaining about the fact that state resources have been used to settle political scores. He did not really have a clear policy position. Instead, it was the alliance left which tried to place him within a particular ideological position, but it was not his. Zuma was never there. He has never really been in the left part of the politics of the liberation movement. Despite that, he was pushed, and he ultimately became the president of the ANC, ironically on the basis of not really representing any clear idea, compared to Mandela, who projected a clear idea in terms of what his presidency represented, in terms of pushing for a national reconciliation. Thabo Mbeki, even before he could become the president, he was very clear in terms of saying that South Africa can succeed without the success of the continent. That is why he was talking about the concept of African Renaissance. But with Jacob Zuma, you could not really pinpoint a particular idea that can actually distinguish his epoch when he was both the president of the ANC and of the country. But maybe we need to give Zuma this. During his presidency, he championed that South Africa become part of BRICS. In other words, it was during his presidency that South-to-South cooperation was actually formalized. But also more importantly, it was during his presidency that the National Planning Commission was actually established. It put together what we call the National Development Plan, which was largely regarded as the country's lodestar for socio-economic transformation. And the National Development Plan was accepted essentially by almost all political parties in parliament. And that was something which was important. It was a basis upon which we could forge national cohesion towards the country's developmental agenda. However, what subsequently came out, it was never really implemented. There are still so many things that the NDP has committed itself to, but there are still so many things that are outstanding. We are far from achieving many commitments that were made in the NDP, which is unfortunate because the NDP managed to widely capture what was and what still continue to be the South African problem. The question of inequality, the question of poverty, the question of unemployment, those continue to still be serious challenges in our post-apartheid society. And not much was actually done, despite the fact that good plans were put in place. And in his second term as the president of the Republic of South Africa, that was when now things started to happen, which became so unfortunate. Presiding over what could one call a corrupt network.
Thabo, as Mashupye says here, the Zuma presidency was dogged by a lot of allegations of corruption, the biggest of which centered around his relationship with a prominent family called the Guptas. What do we need to know about the Guptas?
The infamous Gupta brothers. They are the three brothers who came from India to South Africa after the fall of apartheid. And they ended up having close ties to Jacob Zuma, to the point where a 2018 commission led by South Africa's Deputy Chief Justice then, Raymond Zondo, said that the Guptas had influenced his appointments of cabinet ministers, state officials, and officials of state enterprises in order to benefit corruptly from state resources with impunity.
And this is generally called state capture. What does that mean in the South African context?
State capture, it should be understood as the repurposing of the state and state organs for the benefit of a few politically connected individuals for their own ends, to plunder state resources. It's synonymous with the industrial scale looting of state resources, which crippled state entities such as Eskom, which is the power utility, and Transnet, the transport utility. I asked Mashupye to explain what impact the Gupta scandal had on South Africa's politics.
It was one of the most unfortunate things that has ever happened in our post-apartheid state. It was even so unfortunate that the capture of the state was enabled and facilitated by the very same head of the state who was supposed to be the custodian of our constitutional democracy. The Gupta family scored massive contracts from government, from the state, from your state-owned enterprises. And it did not only end there. The very same family were involved in handpicking who should become a director in your state-owned enterprises, and also they were involved in terms of deciding who should become a minister. And that was so unfortunate.
South African police have raided the luxury home in Johannesburg of the Gupta family in relation to allegations of corrupt business dealings with President Zuma.
Unfortunately, all those came late. The Gupta family had already looted South Africa in a big way. And as a result of that, we found ourselves in a situation wherein we were downgraded by the rating agencies. And that also came at a very bad time in the global economy. Because remember, when he took over as the president of the country, it was at a time when the world was going through global financial crisis. The Gupta family had a huge impact in terms of destroying South Africa's economy, in terms of destroying South Africa politics, in terms of destroying everything that Mandela had actually stood for, everything that all those former leaders of the ANC had wanted. And now we are struggling to really correct whatever is still left for us to move forward as a country.
After the Guptas fled South Africa to Dubai in 2018, investigations continued into their alleged involvement in state capture. In 2023, an extradition bid by South Africa failed, and a subsequent court trial featuring a Gupta-linked company ended in a discharge because of a lack of evidence against the accused. The Guptas deny all allegations of corruption against them. Jacob Zuma has been on trial since May 2021 for allegedly taking bribes from Thales, the French defense group. This is in relation to South Africa's 1999 arms procurement deal. He faces numerous charges of corruption, fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. He has denied the charges against him, but is fighting tooth and nail to avoid the case going ahead. A lot of people will actually be wondering how such a thing could actually happen. How would such a man become the president of the country?
At the time that he was coming into office, he came into office as a person who wanted to ensure that his corruption cases get completely scrapped off the judicial processes. And when he was elected as the president of the ANC, just around that time, the then director of public prosecution dropped charges against him. And Zuma weakened public institutions that were part of the criminal justice system to ensure that his allegation just disappeared. He tried to do the same with the court of law, but the court of law fought back.
The ANC should never be divided in my name. I therefore come to the decision to resign as President of the Republic with immediate effect.
In 2018, Zuma resigned as the president of the country, not that he was left with much choice. How did Jacob Zuma's leadership shape the trajectory of the ANC and its role in South African politics, both during his presidency and thereafter in the years that followed?
He also destroyed the ANC, but at the same time also we need to emphasize that the ANC has in many ways, at least at that time when he was still the president, allow itself to be destroyed by Jacob Zuma because an organization, very old organizations such as the ANC, can only be destroyed if it is willing to be destroyed. And that much started to also show in how the ANC performed in subsequent elections. You could see that largely most South Africans are actually disgruntled. They are not happy with the direction that the country is actually taking under the leadership of the ANC, which at some point it was under the leadership of Jacob Zuma. It will take a miracle that it could change that, because much of how the ANC, even under the new leadership, is currently perceived is largely as a result of how the leader in the form of Jacob Zuma led the organization and led the country.
Looking back, what do you make of the path that South Africa has taken in the last 30 years, from the era of Mandela up to Zuma?
We started well with a high sense of hope, optimism. We went to Mbeki with an almost similar sense of optimism, looking at the Mbeki presidency, translating what was promised essentially during Mandela's era into practice. Mandela was more focused on reconciling South Africa, which was a very important project at that point in time. Mbeki focused largely on building state capacity to deliver on the things that the ANC has promised South Africans. Came Zuma. The first few years, he started well. Unfortunately, the better part of his presidency was characterized by a systematic destruction of the country.
So, Thabo, Mashupye's assessment here is that the Jacob Zuma years really left the country in a shambles, both politically and economically, and that his leadership left the ANC considerably weakened.
He really did. And since then, the ANC's biggest task has been to undo all of that damage that Zuma has done.
Eventually, the Zuma years did come to an end in 2018, and he's replaced by Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president, who we'll be talking more about in our final episode of this series. But let's end this episode with a bit of reflection on what role the ANC had and still has in changing the lives of ordinary South Africans. How's it viewed right now?
Well, the ANC remains South Africa's dominant political force. With its historical role in leading the nation out of apartheid. And for now, it's still got a majority in the country's parliament. Here's Michael Sachs.
I think the three things that we can thank the ANC for: peace, in a sense. There's a lot of violence. We're a violent society, but there is not warfare. There's peace. We have a free press. People are free in that sense. And non-racialism, and that politics is not constructed around racial or tribal identities. It is to some extent, but at least in a formal sense, everyone has to make an effort to demonstrate that they are popular amongst all the population. So what the ANC has not been able to do is achieve another big goal of the liberation struggle, in my view. And that is the creation of a common society. So we accept each other's racial identities and all of that, but we are not a common society. And in many respects, South Africa has become more segregated than it was under apartheid. In the sense that housing, if you look at human settlements and where people live, the contrast between affluent areas and poor areas is even greater. We have the emergence of gated communities where whole swathes of the country are essentially off limits for, let's say, black entrepreneurs that want to sell house to house. There are two healthcare systems. There's a private healthcare system for the top 10% of the population, and there's a public healthcare system for everybody else. The same increasingly in education, as the public sector, the public schools are facing financial challenges. The affluent class tends to be non-racial, but the majority that is poor is black and excluded from economic participation. And those divisions, I believe, have actually worsened in a pragmatic, quantitative sense. And that is why I believe South Africa is not developing. That is the fundamental reason why we continue to stagnate. And until we can build a common society, things are likely to get worse.
What reforms or strategies do you think are necessary to ensure more equitable distribution of economic opportunities in the country? So economic justice. How can the country attain economic justice?
I don't think the ANC in its current form has the capacity to take the country forward out of the problems it's facing. I think it is an exhausted force. And I think the reason it is exhausted is that the fundamental objective of the liberation movement was democracy and a common society and dignity for black people. We could not have had a stable and effective democracy in South Africa if we didn't have this broad church of national unity behind the ANC, in which contradictions could be smoothed over. It was highly necessary. But its capacity to go past that role of just simply uniting people for these basic fundamental rights, its ability to go past that and achieve a different agenda of change, of economic and social change, I don't think it can. And I think it has increasingly demonstrated that over the last 20 years. And so I think we need new forces to emerge and disrupt the ANC. And maybe if the ANC has some time in opposition, maybe it will come back and reconnect with its historic progressive roots. It's possible. But in its current configuration, I don't see any real possibility of the ANC providing us with the leadership that will enable South Africa to grow and develop and become a common society.
I asked Mashupye a similar question about the state of the country. He offered perhaps a more optimistic view of the future.
We now have Cyril Ramaphosa, who also took the country from the lowest ebb in terms of the damage that Zuma has done. And unfortunately, also in his case, he found himself in a context wherein he had to live with Zuma's loyalists. But on the other hand, there are expectations that the ANC must renew itself. The country must also be taken forward. I do have hope, Thabo, that we can turn things around as long as we could learn to say that the solution to the problems of this country do not only lie with those who are actually occupying leadership position within the state. There are so many people within society who have a role to play in terms of making sure that we take this country forward. We could still pull through as a country as long as we can all have a sense that if we destroy this country, we'll be left with nothing.
Thank you, Thabo, for these conversations you've been having with Michael and Mashupye. We'll be getting more into the Cyril Ramaphosa presidency in our next episode, the final part of this series. I know you've been having some good conversations for that one too.
Yes, we'll be talking to scholars Stembi Lembede and Richard Calland and exploring the challenges South Africa faces today, 30 years after the end of apartheid, and what young South Africans think of Mandela and his legacy.
Okay, thank you, Thabo. That's it for this episode of What Happened to Nelson Mandela's South Africa. Huge thanks to this series go to our colleagues at The Conversation Africa, Gary Oberholzer, Jabulani Sekekani, Caroline Southey and Moina Spooner. This series was written and produced by Mend Marawani with assistance from our producer Katie Flood. I'm the show's executive producer. Sound design was by Eloise Stevens and our theme music is by Nita Saul. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor and Alice Mason does our social media. You can find us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us at podcast@theconversation.com. If you like what we're doing, please support our podcast and The Conversation more broadly by going to donate.theconversation.com. Thanks for listening.